For more on what the U.S. hopes to achieve with this move regarding Ukraine, let's bring in Daniel Hoffman, retired CIA station chief who served 5 years in Moscow and is currently vice president of the Sonoran Policy Group. But thanks for joining us on this holiday weekend. I know it's busy out there. First, how significant of a switch is this as far as our policy in Ukraine and providing this weaponry, this defense weaponry?
Well, let me just start by making 2 points by way of background. First, this shouldn't come as much of a surprise to the Russians. The Trump administration has been talking about providing lethal aid to the Ukrainians going back to July of this year. And viewers may recall President Trump's speech in Poland in which he called on Russia to cease its destabilizing activities in Ukraine. Secondly, these Javelin anti-tank weapons are indeed very important. The Russians are sending T-72 tanks to the separatists they back in the Donbass region, and these Javelin weapons will definitely help the Ukrainians push back and attempt at least more effectively to assert some territorial integrity in that region.
You know, after Moscow's annexation of Crimea in 2014, this has been a deadly conflict. A lot of folks have referred to it as a low-grade war, but 10,000 people have been killed. And you know, you spent time there in Moscow, so you're aware that Russia has a very active propaganda machine. And in this instance, they've said essentially that by the U.S. taking this action, it will only push the Ukrainian forces towards war. What would your response be to essentially that allegation coming from the Russian side of things?
Yeah, it's typical of the Russians to try to twist things like that. Look, it's the Russians who've been the ones mounting aggressive military campaigns against the Ukrainians, and it really goes back to April of 2008 when NATO announced its plans to issue a membership action plan to Ukraine, and that really caused the Russians great concern. And then, of course, the Russians were supporting separatists in the Donbass region and annexed Crimea. There will be significant bloodshed in Ukraine. The hostilities have increased over the last couple of weeks. But it's Russia who is at fault. They're trying to impose a modern-day version of the Brezhnev Doctrine, where they really limit the sovereignty of the nations in the former Soviet Union.
And Kiev has made very clear that they believe it's Russia that has provided the troops and the tanks, of course, that they need this anti-tank missiles for. A senior Russian diplomat makes the argument that arming the Ukraine, the United States, quote, raises the danger of derailing the process of peaceful settlement in Ukraine. I mean, where were we on the peaceful settlement process? Was that going anywhere?
Yeah, not really going anywhere. It's pretty well stalled, and one might make the argument that by providing these anti-tank weapons, we're showing that the Russians, we have some skin in the game, that we're supporting a democratically elected government in Ukraine, and that if there may be any hope for some sort of a peace settlement, maybe this will help drive it. But ultimately, I think the Russian endgame for Ukraine really is to support this separatist movement, perhaps even integrate them in some fashion into Ukraine as a fifth column, to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO, never joins the European Union. That's really an existential threat to Vladimir Putin's regime security.
You know, speaking of the Russians, this is unlikely to warm any of our relations with Russia. And as you mentioned, this is something that Putin may have a broader strategy regarding. And is this the U.S.'s opportunity to sort of push back against that broader aggressive strategy that Russia is putting forward?
Well, I think we have a multi-pronged, strategy with Russia. We saw just a week ago or so when the president had a very friendly conversation over the phone with President Putin, and there was some cooperation on counterterrorism. I think there is a little bit of, albeit constrained, opportunities for us to work together with the Russians on counter-narcotics and counter-proliferation and counter-terrorism, while at the same time serving our own national security interests. In this case, in Ukraine, there could also be some opportunities on arms control discussions and maybe something limited on North Korea as well.
All right, Daniel.
It's a complex relationship, and I think we have to understand that it's nuanced. And those who made too much of the president's polite conversation with Vladimir Putin should now take a look at this very forceful assertion of our national security policy.
All right, Daniel Hoffman, thank you very much weighing in on this important topic. Developing story tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.